Can we honestly say that today's diets are better than those from earlier generations? Every decade from the 20th century onward has been a whirlwind of change, shaping the world in ways we couldn't have imagined. Let's see how our eating habits have changed since 1940. We are going to start this list off with the 1940s, because that is where a lot of massive changes in eating habits first formed. That happened due to the Second World War, where a lot of the contemporary dieting styles that the nation had taken to were pretty counterintuitive. People had little time to adjust to rationing as a daily reality, but they adapted quickly. Once they did, appetites shrunk, frugal recipes became the norm instead of lathering your toast with much more butter than you would need, and a focus on nutrition-based eating instead of food for comfort started becoming the priority. Today, that mindset feels completely outdated. We can get cuisines from all over the world either delivered to our doorstep or just a few steps away if we live in any kind of commercial area, and most areas are commercial with pretty well-developed restaurants and food establishments. People do not starve like they were in the 1940s, when you had to stretch a loaf of bread for as long as you could. Now people simply enjoy their meals. And with the rise of social media, content creators go the extra mile to make their food visually appealing and attention-grabbing. That is literally the opposite end of the spectrum from the 1940s, where the goal was all about preserving food and letting nothing go to waste at all. The 1940s are a prime example of how people prioritized survival and budgeting in their eating habits, though deep down, everyone longed for a time when food could be enjoyed without restraint. Rationing kind of led to an increase in general openness towards packaged and tinned products, though there was definitely space for them in people's hearts and homes before that too. It is just that from the 1950s onwards, these kinds of products got even more attention throughout the mainstream because of the focus on everything being seasonal. Your mangoes, grapes, peaches, and the like only came around in the summer, and if tropical tranquility was on your checklist for the year, then you would be pretty smart if you invested in some preservation methods. Of course, the best one, there was nothing like a basket of colorful fruits, rich in vitamins, lasting 2 to 3 days longer than expected, right? For each season's haul of magnificent fruit, there was a different market suffering incredible rush because people wanted to be the first to bag all the fresh goodies. It was a much different time than the one we live in now, and people had to visit markets dedicated to having the freshest supplies of fruit. A real first-come-first-serve mentality had taken over. The thing about this is, it is something that is completely gone now culturally. People can get imported fruits, and so the concept of a certain snack meal or anything really being seasonal is totally a relic of a sentiment now. It speaks to the convenience we live in. But you really can get a mango in October too. In the 50s, people still had to work around the ebb and flow of the year, and their diets were still molded by the recession and wars, so they were very much used to eating little throughout the day and keeping full with fruits. Most of the cuisine of America was pretty self-contained and did not extend past the country much, at least until the 60s. You had your ham and roast turkeys, but beyond that, there was not a lot of culinary innovation or just a lot of style, glitz, and glamour going around in the food world. One reason for this was the heavy influence of post-war military food research. The focus was on long-lasting, easy-to-ship meals like canned meats and dehydrated foods that could withstand long periods of storage and transport. People had their favorites that became regular building blocks of their diet, and that was that. The day started with bacon and ended with a meatloaf, and everything in between was filled with whatever was there at the diner or roadside inn. If a pub had good fries to go with the beer, that was pretty all right. If not, then they at least had dry fruit. American cooking and food did cover a lot of things beyond, but this is about the bigger picture. We are taking a look at the road that the national diet has followed to end up to the point where a lot of the personality and flair we just mentioned was missing, has become a common trait of food in America today. The 1960s were a great example of this, and probably the best starting point on the topic. This is because America first started breaching ever so slightly beyond its bubble in this decade, when the masses of Uncle Sam's nation first began taking an interest in cuisines from countries besides their own. And no, that does not mean French cooking. There is more to the world's food than just whatever the French have got going on every other Wednesday. For the very first time, the cookbooks in America began to include European breakfasts and lunches, Mexican spices and salsas, and curries and rice dishes from the subcontinent. People credited it to the massive boom that tourism experienced in a post-war world, or because many countries were establishing themselves in a new global landscape. Either way, the world was slowly making its way to becoming more connected, and Americans discovering better and tastier food was only the first part of that. You talk about the 70s, you can never escape the conversation without some mention of Elvis or Star Wars or any other kind of phenomena unique to that explosive decade. Culture, country, and cooking all collectively took rounds in the ringer as they went through renovations, changes, and in some cases, total upheavals. One of those changes was that despite how just a decade or two ago we were talking about rations and fruits and how people have the appetite of a fairy now, meat eating suddenly was back on the horizon. We mean all kinds of meat, red, lean beef, poultry, chicken. People were even eating squirrels. Moms even had Monday meatloaf nights and Wednesday pork chop nights, with Friday being reserved especially for some high-class spaghetti and meatballs. This all started because of terrible harvests in 1972, which led to the food price spiral in the subsequent year. As a result, the demand for meat was back harder than ever before as people's regular diets were becoming inaccessible and more expensive. Beef consumption alone rose over 33% between 1963 and 1967. People were eating more meat than they ever had before and buying it as less of a price than they had ever spent on protein. That kind of bargain gets everybody hauling out of bed to the butcher's real bright and early. The average American ate around 14.5 chickens a year in the 1970s, and an average person ate around 86 pounds of beef annually. Maybe this is a trend that could have died down like it did before, and the cycle of greens to fruit to meat and back to greens again would continue as it always does, but the innovation in fast food and the dawn of delivery systems was soon going to occur, which would change eating in America forever. Have you ever heard of the term TV dinner? It was something that started cooking before the 1980s, but it got its ticket to the big leagues in terms of historical impact in that decade, and only that one alone. While the TV dinner left a lasting impact on American culture and diets, you might be surprised to learn that it all began due to leftover Thanksgiving turkey at a company called Swanson. A salesman there had noticed they had around 250 tons of frozen turkey left over that was essentially going to just be wasted. If it were one or two, you could give them away and call it a day, but the situation was that 260 tons were there, and they had no idea what to do with any of it. The bigwigs eventually decided on serving the turkeys up with cornbread and stuffings on aluminum trays that could be heated in the oven. This led to their first full year of selling these trays commercially, and they sold over 10 million. Then, Banquet and Morton Frozen Foods, two rival companies, soon took their own take on the idea out for a spin. Swanson made a business move that can only be described as pure genius. They recognized the growing trend of women entering the workforce in large numbers, which created a new problem. Families needed convenient meal solutions, as moms were no longer available to prepare dinner every night. This was the introduction of what was literally called TV dinner. Yes, that is the name of their product. Pop one in the oven, and 20 minutes later, you had a complete meal that, while not as good as homemade, was still satisfying and convenient. In the 1960s alone, almost every home had a TV set, with around 87% of homes having TV as a daily activity. Swanson even got their hands in the advertising around this rise in TV sets being sold, and advertised those same moms going to work serving up these TV dinner meals to their family. By the 80s, it was a full-on movement, and the convenience was unmatched. People could not resist, and their business strategy was already golden. By now, you might have noticed a general direction that American food is heading in. By the 70s, we had people finding their love for meat again. By the 80s, we had people realizing that food tastes best when it is convenient and hot. So what would the 1990s bring for America? It was fast food, and you might be thinking that McDonald's and KFC were already around before the 90s, and sure they were. But we are talking about setting the stage for the complete domination that the fast food industry has enjoyed the past few decades. Nobody can deny that America and burgers have become as associated as the sky and birds, But why did that ever happen? Was it the fact that in the 90s, fast food restaurants started becoming 10 times more accessible? They added drive-thrus, indoor seatings, and incredibly affordable family meals where you could get a burger, fries, and a shake all for $2. Was it the burger wars of the 80s and 90s that happened because customers had more choice than ever before with all kinds of fast food places popping up? Or maybe we can pin it on the dawn of kids' meals and the Happy Meal becoming a nationwide menace as far as obesity rates were concerned. Either way, the previous things that each decade left with their impacts all resulted in a reset on the American relationship with food. Out with the home-cooked meals, in with the cheap, affordable, convenient, and really nearby fast food. It struck that perfect line between feeling and tasting good enough that you felt like, oh, we just had food from outside, while also being affordable enough that you could incorporate it into your regular life. That is a pretty dangerous mix that can spread like wildfire, and that is exactly what happened as America got hooked onto its rising fast food industry. The 2000s saw all of these trends becoming more and more prevalent once again. While not to the same level as their own respective decades, the way they shaped the food scene in America was something that really peaked in the 2000s. The health crisis also gained attention in this era, leading to backlash against fast food giants. This decade also marked the rise of food documentaries like Super Size Me in 2004, which shed light on the dangers of a fast food-heavy diet and encouraged some shifts toward healthier eating. As the U.S. embraced its new culinary identity of being a fast food-heavy country that delights in meat eating and foreign cuisines. People were exploring things they never had before, diets that were not popular at all in the past decade like the keto diet, and the Atkins diet became famous. This was also the case for processed, packaged, and frozen snacks, and meals became inseparable from the average fridge. Baking, inspired by French culinary trends, became popular, with everyone suddenly enjoying cupcakes. At the same time, America went back to its roots by putting bacon in literally everything it could conceive. This was also the era when Cupcake Mania hit hard, with shows like Cupcake Wars sparking nationwide interest in gourmet cupcakes. Cupcakes were no longer just a birthday treat. They became an artisanal creation, with shops like Magnolia Bakery in New York leading the charge in making them a trendy dessert. There was also some backlash from the recent noise the fast food chains that had begun popping up everywhere were making. People started demanding healthy restaurants with competitive prices to show up, but they still could never really rein in the onslaught of convenient and greasy fast food. This was likely one of the unhealthiest decades in modern American history, with child obesity rates skyrocketing. This led to things like locavore culture, which was a term made by San Francisco locals in 2005. It encouraged citizens to go back to locally grown and harvested food. And in 2007, it was the word of the year, so safe to say the movement got some clout. With the global economic downturns of the decade, consumers had tighter budgets and markets were eager to offer low-cost, high-convenience options. Chipotle in particular was very happy as a brand during this decade. All in all, it was a decade where the work put in by the past 6 ones finally came to a head. So in the 1990s, we saw fast food rising to the throne, and in the 2000s, we saw a country that had suffered dearly economically begging for more and more low-priced food. Now mind you, eating outside also means the additional costs of going out, fuel, two-way transport, and social costs like buying drinks or a full meal so you would not look cheap. The 2010s turned the whole script in reverse and decided that it was time for people to be done with all that and only pay one cost for having their favorite restaurant food: delivery. Delivery services and systems became a massive popularity in the 2010s, with things like DoorDash and Uber Eats becoming pretty much a nationwide fact of life that people would regularly use. Remember how WhatsApp just popped up one day? Now we all cannot live our professional lives without it? The same thing happened with delivery apps, and now everybody has them on their phone. Obviously, you do not need any introduction to why we get food delivered. You and we are part of the generation that grew up in this. However, to people who were just coming into it, it was incredible. The amount of convenience and variety they could now enjoy was something they had never imagined, and for once, people of every generation were simply full, well-fed, and happy. We live in a post-COVID world, and whatever way you slice and dice the situation, the pandemic was the single biggest global event in recent history, and it brought the world to its feet. The 2020s had a global crisis as the start-off signal to the decade, and that meant that people were already in a pretty tired spot and mentality from the get-go. Naturally, who could blame anybody? It was exhausting for everyone involved, and the lack of energy meant people changed the way they ate too, not just their social habits and staying at home. Baking trends surged during the lockdown, with banana bread and sourdough starters becoming two of the biggest food crazes during the pandemic. People turned to comfort food and simple recipes, as flour and yeast even became scarce in grocery stores due to the high demand. Since it was a lot harder to go out and get food, and since deliveries were being discouraged heavily to keep infections under control, people got into home cooking and baking once again. The thing is, though, this is a country whose current population more or less grew up on fast and convenient food, either being a step away from them or getting delivered to their doorstep. They had to start small and slow, and a lot of pandemic cooking and post-COVID meals are pretty simple, low effort, quick and lazy. They get the job done and they do not go above or beyond. What you see is what you get. And sure, the person who has a bit of DIY experience and knows what they are doing will spice their food up no problem, but people who were just getting into cooking kind of drew the short end of the stick. Nowadays, we are moving back to how it used to be before the pandemic, but COVID is always lurking in the background and cases still happen today. A lot of people decided to stick to their home-cooked lifestyle afterwards too, so nothing is really exactly the same. And here's how our eating habits have changed over the decades. If you liked the video, subscribe, and let's keep these memories alive.